So this is the European lecture for 27th May 2022, European history. And we've just seen the history of Japan, sort of, which was funny, and the fallen of World War II, which was grim. And it behooves us to ask why. Not about the war, that's obvious. But why, since World War II, have wars been smaller and less frequent, and increasingly less frequent, at least up till this year? Why? You've been educated in history by me and other people, and you're sensible, thoughtful people.
I mean, especially among the European countries, nuclear deterrent.
Explain it.
Well, so NATO especially has an attack on one is an attack on all.
Yep.
And NATO, a large part of the major European countries are in it.
Can you explain? I will be explaining myself, but can you explain briefly what NATO is, since you mentioned it?
It's like a coalition, an alliance, a group of countries that agree to protect each other.
Yeah, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was originally established to prevent what happened after World War I, the rise of totalitarianism in Europe, to happen after World War II. So, to counter the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain, the United States sets up a military alliance with Western Europe. An attack on one is an attack on all, north of the Tropic of Cancer, which is basically in the Northern Hemisphere. It doesn't include colonial wars. And since then, though we came close several times to going toe-to-toe in full nuclear war with the Soviets, we didn't. Thank God. And so you say nuclear deterrence. Would you or someone else like to explain what that means in human terms rather than in political speak? You start, you continue.
It's basically the principle of mutually assured destruction, which is when if you invade someone and you have nukes and the other person has nukes, there's a high likelihood that you're going to use nuclear weapons because you're going to end up resorting to that even if it's your last choice.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that if you use nuclear weapons, the other opponent will surely use nuclear weapons as well.
Mm-hmm.
And with the amount that we have stockpiled, currently it's enough to end the world's population over 15,000.
Do you wish to add to that?
Yeah, it's basically what he said, the concept of mad mutually assured destruction, where if you throw bombs and weapons at me, I'm going to throw a nuke back, and if you throw a nuke back at the other guy, and there's just so many that at that point, once everything's done, everything's done exploding, there's no one left. There
is a certain innocence about nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm going to actually challenge the wisdom that you just said. You're right, but it's out of date. When I was your age, there were about 50,000 hydrogen and atomic weapons in the world. About 30,000 were in the hands of the Soviets, about 20,000 were in the hands of the Americans, and the British, then the French, the Chinese had a few dozen each. At that time, when I graduated high school in 1984, had the button been pushed, the ambient temperature on planet Earth would have become 15,000 Fahrenheit degrees, and even the roaches would not have survived. It is likely that all life on this orb would have been destroyed, except maybe in the deep oceans, the black smokers, maybe not. Today, the numbers of nuclear weapons since the Cold War have been reduced and reduced and reduced. I believe the Russians have about 6,000 that they admit to. I think we have about the same, maybe a little less. We're talking a significant reduction. The Chinese are increasing their nuclear stockpile, and they don't tell anyone what they're really doing anyway, so we wonder. But it's unlikely that they have as many as the Russians or the Americans do. Since then, we have new powers. The British and the French maintain a small nuclear deterrent. The Chinese have been increasing. The Israelis have had a nuclear deterrent since the 60s. They don't admit to it. The Japanese have the potential to have a nuclear deterrent. They don't talk about it, although I suspect they're building it. to defend themselves against the Chinese communists. The North Koreans have nuclear weapons. The Pakistanis have nuclear weapons. The Indians have nuclear weapons. The Iranians, I'm sure, by this point have nuclear weapons. The South Africans used to. The Libyans were trying to. Um, but the numbers of nuclear weapons that these lesser powers have are in the dozens, for the most part. The fear of nuclear war is, trying to say this in a non-vulgar way, there is an innocence about it, because the truth is the ecosphere could handle a small nuclear war. It wouldn't be pleasant, certainly not for those who were hit, even less pleasant for those who were killed slowly by radiation poisoning or by starvation or everything else. But the ecosphere could survive. Human civilization could survive a small nuclear exchange, depending upon how it was dispersed. And if all of the current weapons were used, it would not necessarily end all life on Earth the way it would have back in 1984. Unfortunately, the reduction in nuclear stockpiles, oddly, makes nuclear war possibly more likely, because it becomes thinkable to fight a limited nuclear war and maybe get away with it. One of the reasons why we have nuclear weapons in the form of bombs that are dropped from bombers, missiles that are dropped from bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles that are shot from underground silos, and the most reliable form, submarine-launched ballistic missiles that are launched from very hard-to-detect nuclear ballistic missile submarines, is because we don't want a Pearl Harbor that is nuclear. The fear is that the American nuclear forces, and the Soviets had the same fear, would be wiped out in a sneak attack, and then the enemy would have nukes still, and we wouldn't. So we'd have to deal with surrendering or being conquered. But the fear is a salutary one. It's a good one, in that it has prevented war. The current risks, I will at least mention. Due to Western inattention after the Cold War, the relative strengths of West and East are not as imbalanced as they should be. In other words, the Americans stopped spending significant money on their military, and during the War on Terror, much more was spent on warfighting in the Middle East than on preparing and modernizing our nuclear forces, our Air Force. We still largely rely on F-15 aircraft and F-16 aircraft that were designed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Russians have fewer, but more modern and better aircraft in the form of the Sukhoi 27 family. The Chinese are building newer planes as well. Yeah.
Speaking of the aircraft, you mentioned F-16. Yes, in my opinion, they were designed way back when.
They're good.
Designed in the 70s.
They're very good.
They're very good aircraft that are continually modernized and are still able to compete on a near-peer adversary basis.
One hopes. And I say one hopes because we don't know. We also invested...
The Israelis use the F-15 quite extensively.
Yeah, the Israelis, though, man for man, are better than we are, I would say.
Yeah. No, they definitely are.
The problem is that the airframes are wearing out. And we have not invested in modernizing. We invested a ridiculous amount in a wonderful fighter, the F-22, which Obama canceled, and in the F-35, which is an interesting question. It's not really a fighter. What it is it's a penetrator bomber. It's an electronic warfare aircraft, but it is slower and it maneuvers more poorly than any other fighter in the world. And we've invested heavily, and so have our allies, in that. The question is, does high-tech counterbalance these aerodynamic weaknesses? In any event, the point is, and I am going to call on you, with the smaller numbers of nuclear weapons and with the relative weakness of the West compared to what it could have been, this provides opportunity. In Moscow, I'm sorry, I do not accept the notion that Putin is fighting a defensive war. I think that Putin was trying to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO, which we could have done 10 years ago. It didn't happen. But in any case, he's launched the largest war in since 1945, at least in terms of Europe, and one of the largest wars in the world: Vietnam, Korea, India, China. All of that approached the scale. The real problem, though, is the people funding Putin, who are the People's Republic of China. Their leadership is not like the Soviets were, personally experienced in war. Every Soviet leader until the fall of the Soviet Union, until Gorbachev, had a personal experience with the Second World War. And those death tolls were lowballed, as far as I'm concerned, especially in regards to the Soviets. I think the Soviets lose at least 25, 30 million people in World War II. And all of their leaders, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, they all knew what it was like to be in a country invaded by and destroyed by war. The Soviets, therefore, were opportunistic, but they didn't want a nuclear war. The Chinese leadership is entirely isolated, entirely sealed off. Their only experience is of persecuting their own slave population. They have no experience really running a world-class foreign policy or military policy. The one thing they are dedicated to is to not do what Gorbachev did, and to not do what may happen to Putin, which is allow themselves to be overthrown. They've made very clear since Tiananmen Square that they would launch a war like that if it would keep them in power. And they are now either the second most powerful military in the world or the most powerful, depending upon how you measure it. And that inexperience, and frankly their weakness domestically, they're very unpopular. And they are not running China well. Make it more likely that they'll do a stunt with Taiwan or elsewhere. And if they do a stunt with Taiwan or elsewhere, we're involved. Because we have defense agreements, and because Taiwan is a major silicon chip manufacturer for the free world. And if we lose that, that's bad. But it's complicated. The Chinese are not the Soviets. They're more dangerous in certain respects. Still, you've been waiting so long. Thank you.
I was just going to ask, why has the number of nuclear weapons gone down so much?
Because after the fall of the Soviets, the West decides to invest in Russia. Unlike the Marshall Plan, which I'll tell you about, which rebuilds Europe, and a version of it which rebuilds Japan, the money that was spent in Russia in the 1990s was given to commissars who often became crime lords, who often became oligarchs. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia fell into real decline. A poverty-ridden economy with a lot of poor people, very few middle-class people, and a few very wealthy people who have power both in the criminal world and in the world of government. A lot of former special forces and spies went into power, including Putin, who was basically a KGB officer, their version of the spy service, the CIA. And that, if you understand that, you understand everything he's done since taking power. But the Soviets, when they lost the Cold War, something happened which they didn't expect. You see, the best thing to happen to any country in the world in the early and mid-20th centuries is to lose a war with the United States, because we'll rebuild the country better than before. And we did that again and again, but not with the Soviets, not with Russia. The corruption, the government, and frankly, the commitment on our side under Clinton was insufficient. So Russia was allowed to drift, and the dark forces took over. I don't know if that answers your question. But no, yeah, the reduction in nuclear weapons, the idea is the Cold War is over. We can make the world safer by reducing stockpiles, so that even if there is a nuclear war, it's not going to be the 50,000 exchange that it would have been. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Reduction in stockpiles actually, in some ways, can embolden people. Another aspect of this is that since World War II, the birth rate and the lifespan of people around the world has improved quite dramatically. because Western medicine was spread by the United States and by the free world, and by the Soviets with their allies, into the benighted savage regions of the planet. After the fall of the Soviets, this actually increases. One of the reasons the globe has a population problem is because the societies of sub-Saharan Africa, of Latin America, and of South Asia have modern technology which preserves life, unless you're talking abortion, the life of infants to survive to be born, the life of children to survive to become adults and have children of their own. So the likelihood of dying is much lower now than it was during the Cold War, and it was much lower then than it was before the Cold War. But the cultures have not adapted, not yet anyway. In the West, where we develop industry and modern medicine, there are generations where you go from having families of 8 to 12 children, because most of them are going to die before they have kids anyway. And this is something that the book talks a lot about. You reduce the size of the number of children that you're going to have to 2, 3, or 4. Basically, replacement with a slight increase in population, which is what Western economies and societies have been doing since they became industrialized. In Japan, this has happened. In China, something freaky has happened with population, which I'll talk about. But in sub-Saharan Africa, the more of a man you are, the more kids you have. And that hasn't changed in 60 years since they began getting modern medicine. In Latin America, the more of a man you are, the more seed you spread, the more children you have. In South Asia, same thing. And it's not just the men, the women as well, the children of the future. But you have families that are 6 to 12 kids, where most of them live and then have children. This is how we've had a population that has ballooned and ballooned and ballooned since then. On the one hand, it's wonderful. You have a better chance to have a good life as a human being since World War II than at any time in history. But on the other hand, there is the real threat to global population, which I don't believe is climate change. I believe it's overpopulation. How do you deal with that? Well, the Chinese dealt with it by a heavy-handed government one-child policy, where a lot of girls were killed. Because if you can have only one child, it better be a boy, because the boys take care of you in old age. The boys carry on the family name. Girls go to other families. Why do you think so many Asian girls are adopted in the United States? Because they're disposable. A family that has a girl that puts it up for adoption can have a boy. So this policy went on in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, into the 2010s. And so China today has a radical imbalance between the number of young men and the available pool of young women. I've said since the 80s, this is the only way that this population imbalance is going to right itself is by war, where the Chinese use their excess male population aggressively. And we're in that stage now where that population bubble does exist. So I guess the point of this rambling discourse is to get you to see just how wonderful things have been since World War II. We focus on the dark side. Even now with the war in Ukraine, even now with the troubles in China, the world, and the supply chain and all the other stuff, the world is in still so much better shape than it was before World War II. Anyway, next week, we see you on Tuesday. We'll do the Holocaust and the post-World War II world. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
And remember the fallen on Memorial Day.